everyone. Nice to meet you all. Welcome to the lecture series of WeGo Smart City Champions. I am Jun-Seok Hwang, a professor of technology management, economy, and policy major, and Smart City Global Convergence major at Seoul National University. Let me tell you about these two majors with two eras. The 90s, when I got a doctorate degree in information science and telecommunications from the University of Pittsburgh, was the era of information and communication innovation. ICT connected places that were not previously connected. People were break down time and place restrictions that hinder us from sharing resources, ideas, emotions, and other valuable things in life through ICT. At this time, students who created products and services that provide new utility to people with ICT technology became entrepreneurs, and they are leading the present era. And the students like me who were contemplating the theory and policy in the upcoming ICT world became a professor of technology management. The 2020s, when I established a smart city global convergence major, is the era of smart city in which ideas and knowledge gathered in various fields, including ICT, are converged into the cities where we live. The new paradigm will once again create great leaders as citizens, engineers, entrepreneurs, administrators, and scholars. And at this time, you are main characters of this story. Today, I'm gladly we have two co-lecturers, and they are Dr. Yves Dacourt and Dr. Beatriz Botera Arcila. Yves Dacourt is a renowned humanitarian leader, international strategist, influencer, and change maker. His current focus is on the theme of security, social contract, and the role of cities in the age of digital surveillance and pandemics, which is the subject of a special initiative, the Edgelands Pop-Up Institute, that he is leading at Harvard Bachman Klein Center for Internet and Society. For the past 10 years, from 2010 to 2022, Yves was the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. And prior to his appointment as a Director General, he held the post of Head of Communication Division and Director of Communications. Beatriz is an assistant professor at Sciences Po Law School in Paris and co-founder and head of research at the Edgeland Institute. Her research and expertise focus on data governance in urban environments and how different governance frameworks have different impacts on people's lives. Her work has explored modes of data governance in the Smart City project, the sharing economy, and COVID contact tracing apps. If anyone is interested in the leverage of open data, Yves Dacourt and Beatriz Botera Arcila are the right people to talk to. And I am so excited for our students to hear from them today. So now, without further ado, let's invite them up. Thank you.
Good day to everybody. Very pleased to meet you. I'm Yves Dacourt. I'm the founder, co-founder, I should say, and the executive chairman of the Edgeland Institute.
And good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone out there. It's great to be here. I'm Beatriz Botero. I'm the other co-founder of the Edgelands Institute.
And Beatriz is not just the other co-founder, she's also the brain of the Edgeland Institute. Maybe just a few words about us and about the Institute, and then we will dig into the questions of smart city, why city are so important, how do we have to look about that, and how do we leverage or not also about data, and maybe more importantly also when you look at city and data, also how do you look at the social fabric of the city and what is interesting into it. A word on me, I've spent a lot of time as a humanitarian, so I'm coming from that background. I've been the CEO of the Global International Red Cross, working in war. So right now, my former colleagues are, of course, very busy with Ukraine and Russia, but also with Afghanistan, Yemen, Myanmar, for example, or North Korea, to take an example close to some of you. And I've been now the founder and the executive chairman of the ENG Institute since a year.
Excellent. And among the other hats that I wear, I'm a professor of law at Sciences Po Law School in Paris, and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And most of my research and work is actually focused on how cities are using data for different public planning and other to improve their functions, but also the different societal risk digitization raises, especially at the city level. And a little bit about us together, maybe. The Edgelands Institute is a pop-up institute that has been around for about a year, as Eve was saying. And we are preoccupied and occupied in thinking through how our social contracts in cities are changing due to digitization. So we're looking at fast digitization, the different trends, the rapid adoption of surveillance technology in particular, and we are interested in exploring how that changes societal relationships, government, how we think about each other, how we relate to each other. So not only with governments, but as citizens, and how we relate to that. In particular, when we're thinking about our physical security or the security of our community. So the real core of the social contract.
And what is interesting is we have decided to have a new design. We established that at Harvard at the Berkman Klein Centers, and now we are an independent research center. I would say a research and a do center, or a think and a do tank. What we have done is, as a pop-up, is we want to be an organization without headquarters, popping up really in places, in that case in cities where we work. So we are working in Medellin, which is a big city, one of the most important cities in Latin America and Colombia, working in Nairobi, Kenya. We are working in Chicago in the US, in Singapore, Beirut, and also Geneva. And I think you have a sense already 6 cities of a very different nature, coming from a different set of country and continent, but also what is interesting, have a very different practice when it comes to digitalization. They all are digital tech. They are all at the top of the digital, if you want, strategy. They are a very important hub. And at the same time, they have very different strategy, but also social contract and practice when it comes to security and the digitalization of security. That's why we selected them. And by being a pop-up, it means that we are not looking at the world through where we are, which is always a risk when you are a research center, because you are based somewhere and you look at the world and you come back there. By having no headquarters, by popping up in a way in the cities, we are really influenced also by the city where we are working. And that's what we try to be able to do.
Excellent. So actually the way we decided to structure this session is that Eve and I are going to interview each other and ask each other questions about both what we're doing at the Institute, but also what we've seen in our professional lives and research lives. And that will hopefully inform the conversations you are having on digitization, on leverage of data. So I'm gonna start. So why cities, Eve? And yeah, why cities? Why do we need to think about cities and digitization in our fast changing world these days?
I would say, first of all, there was always city, or at least since Middle Age, city have been very important in our world, right? Whatever, by the way, was interesting, whatever the culture or the continent. What is maybe interesting is the focus right now over the few years about city is there is at least 2 or 3 reasons. One, we know that more than 55% of the population in the world are living in city. So there is something already about cities and the importance of cities. But it's also somewhere where we realize that the political dimension of the city start to be again important. And it is related to 2 things again. One is that we're living in a world where, in terms of international relationship, the world is changing very fast and very quickly, and we see that a lot of polarization, a lot of tensions. We might move from a world that was defined by somewhat the Western world for a long time. I'm thinking about since the Second World War to almost 10 years ago, and since now 10 years, you see a transition in terms of power and international relationship between different sets of actors. And this transition will, I think, still go on for a while. And you see how difficult it is for country to be able to build consensus and also to build global solution to global challenge. And in this moment of almost a bit of a vacuum, we start to see again city playing a bigger role, and not just within each city, but among the cities, right? So I think you can see also a level of collaboration between cities that we have not seen over time. And maybe because they are not stuck into the national politics as we see in other situations. So that's one reason. I think the other reason is because of the city and the diversity of city. City have no other choice than to deal with diversity. That's part of their equation, whatever. Diversity in terms of income, diversity of culture, people, practice, and they have to do that. And there is an expectation that the city authority and the leaders will somewhat be closely associated also to the solutions. And if you look at survey around the world, you will see that people normally, sadly, distrust more and more their government, their national government, or at least there is a bigger distance, whereas they normally, in general, are closer and they feel closely related to the urban authority. So I think there is something about the trust, about the fact that city seems to be, even the big city, kind of a unique identity that where people feel that they are part of it, right? And the last element is city have become more and more a laboratory, almost a lab of testing new things. You have to do it. We've seen that on migration. We see more and more when it comes also to climate change. We start to see that, and we'll talk about that when it comes to data security, where urban planning, of course, where city have no other choice than to quickly move and find solutions. Just look at, for example, the questions of ecology. I think we know that most of the city around the world, the fact that we are living in a world that will be more and more warmer, for example, where the pressure on our resources is increasing, oblige city to really change and have a very different strategy, and to do that now. So they don't have a lot of time. And we see also there is almost a certain agility when it comes to city. And last but not least, I think city have been, not all of them, but most of them have also, the big one, have been very influenced by somewhat the last 30 years in the way we've lived, big space for cars that has really been central in the designing of some of the part of the city, maybe sometimes the suburb. But I'm also thinking about huge building and very, very big cities. And you start to see again that there is a lot of reflections about redesigning the city, making the city closer to the citizen, making the citizen maybe co-participate or co-designing what might be the city. So I think all in all, to say that the city as a central piece of our social fabric seems to be interesting. And last but not least, you can compare also. There is more, I would say, connections and equivalence between city as different as Nairobi or Singapore or Beirut and Chicago, much more connections than there will be between their country, right? And I think there is also something here which is important. And that's interesting. And you can see that in the way we've seen also in the social dynamic, where you do have in every country urban people that are sometimes opposed to rural people. So I think you can see also that there is a trend around that.
Of course, I'm good at myself, sorry. So no, that's very interesting. And there are all these forces putting cities in the front and center of the world. And so where in that equation, if does digitization fall? Where does the concern over digitization and surveillance come for you? And then
I think there is two dimensions. One is, of course, the digitalization of our society is at play in the city for good reason, by the way, to start with transport, for example, and mobility that has been so central And it's so central in every city in the world. So, and I think here there is absolutely no questions. And of course, our own digitalization and our own contribution in a way to the digitalization of a collective of human beings. Here, there is no questions about that. And we've seen over time a growing phenomenon that was starting to talk about smart city. And I think this is also one of the reasons we are together talking about smart city. And I think here there is something very positive about, can we use and leverage, in fact, this collective data, both at the level of the city, but also our own collective level and personal level, to make the city smarter, more organized, more tuned towards the people, guaranteeing and be more efficient also, right? And I think there is something very attractive to that. And at the same time, because we're living maybe an age where trust is not always well founded, or because we see a lot of polarization, but also we've learned a lot over the last element of COVID, we start to see also that just calling smart city is not enough. There is a dimensions about how do we govern that? How do we allow people, me, you, to somewhat reflect about what is happening with the data? And that technology is not because it's technology good for sake of it. There is a need to govern. And then of course, if you link that with security, including, I would say, safety and security, we realize that cities have played an important role and are still playing an important role to manage the situation and the security of their citizens. They have developed and use more and more, in fact, intelligence tool. I'm talking about AI, artificial tools. I'm talking about, of course, everything related to facial recognition, all cyber surveillance. And I think there is a growing questions about how is that used. And we've seen, and maybe I can then ask you questions because I know that you're expert on that. We start to see that there are some challenge, and COVID-19 was not the only one, but it started to show also, wow, we've developed in a lot of cities, but also country, a lot of tools to track people, to see how they are, and sometimes for very good reason, but then realize, oh my God, that in fact the governance of this tool, the way the data are used, the way privacy is ensured or not, the way we collectively build something for good or not, have started to be a question. And that is possibly one of the critical elements that needs to be assessed. So I'm interested, Beatrice, because I know that you mentioned a cyber law professor. I think you are still a rare species. And that's great. I'm intrigued to know, so what are you studying when you are reflecting through the city angle?
Right. Great. So I think everything starts with what you were describing, the fact that digitization is happening everywhere in society, but it's also and especially happening in cities. And one of the things that cities offer for digitization that is very interesting is that the socioeconomic definition of cities are people and capital together in space. And that togetherness in space offers a bunch of data points for different purposes. So now it allows the type of matching that we do when you take an Uber or you pick up a scooter on the street. But it also allows to the population or movement type of evaluation that allows to say how to plan a transportation system, or how were people moving during COVID, to see a little bit where contagion hotspots were doing. That all happens because in cities we live together and we have phones that gather our information constantly, and that information can be used for things. That is especially so in cities, less so than, let's say, the countryside. It's also why Tinder, for example, works more in cities and less so in the middle of nowhere. There's no one to match with. So that's a little bit where digitization and cities start, and why digitization offers a bunch of opportunities for the city government. And some of the typical suspects are the ones you were mentioning. So public transportation, knowing how people move, how people commute, that really allows you to plan your routes, to plan the new bike lane, and to identify where you need a street light or not. Also, especially how energy or water is consumed, for example, there's a lot of potential to be able to track better how people are consuming, when people are consuming energy and water, and that allows public utility planners to do that better. So there are very interesting examples. There are some experiments that cities have done. One of them was during the World Cup of 2010, I want to say, or 2014. And there was a soccer match between Japan and Colombia, actually. And people who were looking at the data of the city noticed that when Japan was playing in Tokyo, people were not going to the bathroom. So there was no sense there was no need to pump as much water, but then during the 15-minute break, you had to pump a lot of water because everyone was on the bathroom break. And that's the kind of efficiencies, that's a silly example, but it proves the point. That's the kind of efficiencies that really using information for the better can really offer. The other things, of course, that we need to take care of and we need to look at when we think about those is how is that information that is being collected used for those good uses and not necessarily being used to strengthen state power in a way that might be concerning. And that's where it gets a little of a slippery slope. Cities are in fact in charge of providing certain forms of security services, and we need those. Like, security is important, and I don't want to convey that all of a sudden we don't believe in security. It matters that you're safe. That's important. But typically when we're thinking about government and when we're thinking about the rule of law, we care also about limiting those we give power to, right? So you allow police officers to stop you on the street, but then there are certain limits to what a police officer can or can't do on the street when they stop you or when they're around and so on. That's a little bit the social contract at its core. We delegate power, but then the person that we gave power to needs to abide by a certain set of rules and constraints to protect us as well. One of the things that we're seeing with digitization is that maybe some of the tools that we had to limit power are no longer being as effective, or digitization offers a lot of power to government and also to private entities who have our information, right? So one of the things that we're looking at is how do we, for example, make sure and create checks on that the information that is used to provide public utilities is not later used for something that has to do with law enforcement without due judicial approval. Typically in law, to gather information, you will have to go to a judge and say, you know, I suspect this person is doing something, and then a judge has to approve. Digitization makes this a little bit harder because the information is already out there, it's vast, it's easy to copy. You know, data is this thing that is very aerial and easy to move from a computer to another, just send an email with an SSV file. So that creates a lot of questions about how are we constraining those uses of information, for example. And then if we move to the law enforcement sector, which is what you were describing right at the end, there are questions there also about how law enforcement in itself is changing and what does that mean. So one of the interesting trends that we see is that law enforcement in a very traditional form, and of course I'm presenting this as a picture of today, and this isn't something that has happened in 3-5 years, it's been happening slowly, maybe 30 years, but now we're really facing it, is that many of the law enforcement things that we're seeing in city are moving towards doing something more similar to intelligence and less to trying to really contain things that are happening. So in an idealistic past, which never existed exactly like that, you would call a police officer when something happens, and it's something of a response type of intervention. What data allows you to do is to be able to gather information beforehand and see where are things most likely to happen. That is excellent for effectiveness and efficiency purposes. So you already have the police officers located in places that are at higher risk. You might stop someone that you think is dangerous before they do something. There's a lot of potential in that. But then also that because information isn't always neutral, or society has a bunch of inequalities and discrimination patterns underlying, what ends up happening, what we see that ends up happening, is that you have communities that are over-policed, or communities who are increasingly targeted as more dangerous than others. And that trickles down into maybe exacerbating certain patterns of inequality, of discrimination. If someone is constantly being targeted as dangerous, that shows up in how they are evaluated in a risk score about whether they get bail or not. And how do we think about those individual rights, and how do we think about constraining the type of power, the type of intervention is important. And then of course, there's also intelligence at the higher level, right? So you have government really gathering information about society at large, and there are questions about how long do they get to store that information for. It's also, for those of you who really want to get into this, it's super expensive to store this information. That's a question that city governments actually often have.
Tell us more about that. Can I ask, Beatriz, can I ask you just a question? Why is it so expensive? I know it's not just a technical question, but it's true. Few of us are aware about all these questions and this change, as you mentioned, between gathering information somewhat to tactically play on it, to something which we've seen in the consummation, I'm thinking about Google and Facebook, all that are using the data to predict our behavior. But we start to see that, as you mentioned, in terms of security. So tell us a bit more, on the evolution, but also on the why is it so complex and expensive to do that?
Okay, I'll start with the expensive, which is interesting. So one of the things that happen when we think about the internet and when we think about data is that this seems to be something that happens like in the clouds, and then the cloud word like actually adds to the metaphor, and we don't really know what that is. It seems like it's not heavy, but eventually somewhere downstream, the internet is also physical, and you have cables on the ocean connecting cities and continents, and you also have very large data centers where eventually all our information is being stored. And keeping those data centers is very expensive. Like at some point, that's what Amazon does very well. Like Amazon Web Services is like a service that most companies in the world actually use to store their information. And so you delegate and you don't see it, but Amazon has grounds full of computers, like not computers that look like my laptop, but basically big disks that are storing that information, and that storing requires cooling systems, requires space. That ends up being expensive. So if you want to, as many governments increasingly want to not delegate storage, but they actually want to do it by themselves because they're scared about who's going to look at their information. Storing information ends up being very expensive, especially for medium-sized cities, for example. Another thing that is expensive in the sense of risk is that the more information you store, the more vulnerable you are to a data leak that puts you as an institution at risk, but also your citizens. So the more information you have with you, and we see this in the news every day, there's a new data leak of very large organizations, people that are actually good at their security practices are being hacked. And so one of the things that you need to balance when you're thinking about storing information is how long do I need this to store this for in case there's a risk. And then there's of course the privacy sort of risk and expensive in the world of at the individual level of how long is your information out there? How long are the things that I did in the past relevant for me in the future? One of the questions that we see, for example, on social media is that you have people, maybe some of you, I don't know, who've been on Facebook or Twitter for many, many years since you were very small. So how relevant is it for whatever your data footprint, whatever you did online at age 13? Maybe it shouldn't be, maybe you should get to be anonymous after a certain year has passed. But what allows you, data storage allows you is that all that thing is carried forward and is still relevant for whatever decision is being made about you in the future. So those are some of the like societal risks that I would say, and they're costly. There are benefits to them, and they're also costs. And one of the questions we need to think about is how we balance them. And I haven't answered the whole question, have I?
No, but you were super interesting. Can I just pursue that question? So yeah. we see that, in fact, as you mentioned, once we go one step further, and we are starting now to dig into the so-called smartness. So you see the importance, and the smartness is related to technology, but technology means data, right? So we agree with that one. And what I find interesting listening to you is we go one step further, and then we start, oh wow, it requires infrastructure, it requires reflecting, it requires time-wide, it requires rules. So tell us a bit more about the framework in which we operate when we think about city and maybe even the smart city, because in a way that is also one of the critical issues. What does govern, what kind of conversation, and what does govern, in fact, all that?
Right. So I think many of the things that we see when we look at the narrative around smart cities, especially the type of corporate narrative that is being pushed forward by smart city vendors, which they're just doing their job. It's not that they're evil, but sometimes we also want to question, like, what are people trying to sell us? Is that smart cities are about making cities more efficient. So it's about the things I was describing before, making water provision more efficient, energy provision more efficient, law enforcement more efficient, transportation more efficient. Efficiently typically means that you're able to do more with less. And that's important at the city government level because you have limited resources, you have limited staff, limited budget. So efficiency as a value might be a good one. But one of the key interrogations that we need to make when we're thinking about adopting these technologies in cities is, what is it that we're making more efficient? If you're making a system that doesn't work very well more efficient, most likely you're amplifying something that already has some collateral harms. So that's one of the examples that we see in some cities that have actually more information on this, when you automate things related to law enforcement. If you have a law enforcement institution in place that tends to be racially biased, for example, and then you automate that because you datafy it and you have algorithms and so on, then the device won't really fix that problem for you. It will most likely just make something that was already working in a way that was concerning more efficient. And then, of course, it adds the layers that technology offers that makes it more complicated, which is it's a little bit more opaque. You're not operating the whole system, you're relying on a third party, so it's harder to audit. Oftentimes, one of the interesting things that we see is that one of the things people are trying to do to avert some of this risk is that you put a human operator in the middle. So you say, okay, I understand the system can be a little bit biased. Why don't we just sit someone down on a computer and they need to supervise the computer? Well, it turns out we are very bad at supervising computers, we humans. And there's two reasons for that. One is because computers are very often right. So eventually you start trusting the computer and you're tired and you want to go home and you have kids and there's life happens. So eventually, because computers are right many times, we trust the computer. But the other thing is that many times it's hard to audit a computer because we don't understand how the decision is being made. So maybe something that doesn't quite work for you as a human supervising, you're too late or it's just quick or so human supervision doesn't really work. So I think the intervention and the critical moment needs to come earlier when we're thinking, is this system that I'm automating working well? And that's one of the key criticisms around the smartness question. Like it's fine to be smart, but what are you being smart about?
And Beatrice, before we explore a bit more the question of the social contract and maybe what people are telling us, right now, internationally, when you reflect about these questions of, I don't know if you speak a little bit about that, but let's say the framework, the legal framework in which smart city are navigating. Could you say a word? What are maybe the elements that need to be observed? I can imagine the governance needs to be observed, for example. What are the critical issues that needs to really be observed and needs where a focus is needed?
Right, that's a great question. I would say there's two different elements in that question. So one of them is all that is related to data governance. And that is maybe something that is particularly interesting for this session. So there are important questions about who should have access to the data that is being collected by the systems that are often deployed in our infrastructures or in public spaces. So in very traditional privacy frameworks, and that might depend a little bit depending on your jurisdiction, but you will have to consent for your data being collected. But then after consent, depending again on the jurisdiction, vendors or city governments can do a lot with that information. It is very hard to consent in the city. I don't go, if there's information being collected about me on a street, I don't want to go around consenting to that, or maybe I still need to use that street, or maybe it's my city infrastructure. And then because with big data, it's easier to re-identify whose information belongs to whom, then consent all of a sudden doesn't really work when we think about data in cities, and we need to rethink. I am prone to think that we need something that I would call a harms-based approach. We need to start identifying harms that we just simply don't want to tolerate and start forbidding those, regardless of whether there was consent. So, for example, my information should only be usable by law enforcement if there is a judicial warrant in between. That's a way of trying to mitigate those things. But how do we think about data governance is an important question. That's the privacy part of it. There's the public utility part of it. So a question is, when we're not thinking about surveillance or privacy, who should be able to use this information for their own benefit? So should cities have access to the information that the ride-sharing companies collect because it's good for city planning? Why yes or why no? So cities might argue this is for the public good, it's collected on my city streets, and then ride-sharing companies might argue yes, but it's my business model. If you have that information, you might release it on open data portals, and my competitors might have access to it. So those trade-offs about how do we treat that information and who should have access to it are one of the interesting conversations happening I think. And you see interesting things with cities really trying to get access to ride sharing actually and scooter data to do planning. And you see interesting privacy concerns rising in those conversations. So that's one part of it, the data part of it. The other part of it is something that I will describe as city power. And there's this question about what cities can do. Something else that is very important to think about when we think about cities and cities in the cities as important political actors is that cities are not sovereign states, and therefore there are only certain things they can do. And oftentimes, actually, the bigger the city and the more powerful the city, the more they are most likely going to be able to do. But still, there are things that are just simply beyond cities' legal powers. And so when I'm thinking about it's about being a little bit critical about what is it that we're making efficient. Sometimes cities are actually, city officers are very nuanced. They know many of the things I'm saying, but they will say, you're right. It would be better to build a park here instead of doing this other thing. But I just don't have the power to build parks. That's just not within my city charter. So I'm just going to do this other intervention. So there's also something about considering critically if we're going to make cities smarter, what are the powers that we're giving them to be able to do better things for their citizens? But then just as we started with the social contract, how are we limiting them? Because we also don't want super powerful cities. We want cities that are in the sweet spot to be able to do many good things and limiting the things that also create risks.
I would like to explore with you is, and we've seen that now at Edgeland Institute, and you are the person leading also the research at Edgeland. What we start to see is at different level of society tensions when you talk about power, right? Especially when you talk about data, predictability, people. So we see if we go for the lower level, us, as people, as citizen, and that's one element. We see then the level of, let's say, maybe the community and the way the community is organized. We see that maybe at the level of the city, and then we see that at the level of nation state. In some country, you would even have at the level of regional or department level. I'm really interested to start with maybe what you've seen if we start at the level of the people. If I reflect just about Edgeland, you just have work right now in Medellin, and maybe if you just say a word about maybe typically, Medellin is not a typical city, but still a quick CV about what type of city is Medellin and what are we learning when we talk to people. And I think also you as an expert, what surprises you?
Okay, I want to say something and then I'll shoot the same question back to you. But this is my perception. So just for those of you who aren't really familiarized with Medellin, Medellin is the second largest city of Colombia, but it's a relatively large city. It has somewhere about 4 to 5 million people. And it used to be famous for being infamous for being the most dangerous city in the world. At some time in the early 90s, you might have seen narcos or different representations in the media about the drug wars that happened in the city and in Colombia at the time. And then fast forward, the city is famous now, thankfully, for a bunch of urban interventions, and then of course in a rather larger national and geopolitical context in which much of that doesn't exist anymore. So 30 years later, it's a large Latin American global South city, so still a little bit chaotic, still facing important questions related to inequality and insecurity, but also with our up and rising middle class, a very fast adoption of technology. And one of the things that the city managed to do was that it was going to sort of address many of its societal issues of the 90s through technology and through urban interventions. So that's a little bit like a very quick cartoon, but all encouraged to go out there and read a little bit about Medellin. And at the Edgeland Institute, we've been doing some of our research and work there, trying to identify what are the tensions around digitization or how it is perceived. There's maybe no tensions, and then working mostly with youth and government and civil society to have important conversations about this. One of the things that have surprised me is how not central to the agenda of regular people this is. So I think there's still something about digitization and security being something that is monopolized by experts, and experts being circles of, let's say, power, but also simply policy elites that are close to city government, close to certain areas of academia, But then once you move 2 steps beyond, most people are not super interested about how digitization might be changing their lives, might be relevant for them, might offer risks and opportunities. That is slightly different with security, which is why security is an interesting entry point. Security does feel close to your heart. You do want to feel safe, and you have something to say about how security has improved or not recently. But then also very quickly it becomes very technical, and it's also something that people don't want to go into with much detail. So I think there's something about this still being very niche, and there's still important work about taking it out there, just because more people will make for better conversations. I'm gonna say 2 more things and then over to you. The second one is how hard it is to have this conversation in a nuanced way. So imagine you go there, you eventually do say, okay, no, we're gonna talk about digitization, and then it is very easy that it turns into a black or white type of situation. Like digitization is the ultimate panacea, and we're going to change the world by wiring whatever is our infrastructure, or this is the most terrible dystopian movie in the world. And landing somewhere in the middle where we can have a nuanced conversation is actually hard. It's very good work, but it's not as easy. And then maybe my third very nice finding in Medellin is that I am very impressed by the work of city government officials. So oftentimes when we talk about surveillance, I think we dismiss how hardworking most of these people are and how they actually want to do things well, and how it matters for them also to know how to do it well, even though they often don't know. They're learning as they go. This has been a very quick transformation, but I think there's a general interest in trying to do things well. That doesn't mean that things can get out of control, because that's one of the paradoxes of institution and people. But those have been some of my three main findings, which is why we need to do more research to be able to enrich that conversation about how to do things well. But I'm curious about you. You've also been in that journey with me a little, so.
Yeah, I think what is interesting is if we just reflect at the beginning of our discussions, is we all are aware of the importance of city. By the way, most of us are living in cities. We are all important about what we call the digitalization of our society. We see that ourselves, we see that our collective, and surprisingly enough, as you mentioned, the conversation are somewhat not that smart or not that central to our life, right? And when there is a conversation, specifically when it comes to governance of data, or even more difficult when it is related to security, the conversation are owned by expert only. And I'm sure all of us, we've seen also conversation about, for example, the tracking tools when it comes to COVID-19. And this conversation was extremely complicated with expert, very different position. And I think there is something about bringing, in fact, the conversation to the people and accepting that the people are their own experts. And I think that is exactly what you've done, what we've done at the Agile Institute, is starting from our own practice. And then that's up to us. When you do a research and a thinker, you need to find the right approach, the right questions, the right curiosity to allow people to express. And I would say what surprises me is how little, as you mentioned, people would be ready to discuss data, and they know it's something about themselves. They know their phone is somewhat looking at that, and they have sometimes a very basic opinion is, I have nothing to hide. And that's it. Or, as you mentioned, they are in a very classical kind of, I hate it, or I don't know, I don't care. I'm also very surprised to see that officials have sometimes very little idea about it also. They are somewhat stuck between what you said, the investment required for technology. It's huge, huge, huge. And that's new also for big budget for cities or big corporates. They had to invest much more. 20-30% of the budgets only go into major infrastructure with sometimes a lot of problems. So they don't know exactly how to do that. And last but not least, as you mentioned, having to face also new regulation. If I look, for example, all the question related to data protection and how important it is in fact truly difficult and complex regulation, complex ethical issues. So all this complexity means that there is a tendency not to be willing to understand and to explore this complexity. And I think what I was struck by in Medellin is as you mentioned, a government, a city authority trying to do their best out of that, still recognizing that they are sometimes overwhelmed by the complexity. I was also struck by when you ask the right questions to the people, when you find the right angle, how much they're ready then to talk about it, right? So if you ask questions about data and governance, they don't know. But if you start to go one level down, which is okay, how is your security provided? Who is in charge of your security? How much is then, are you aware that your phone, and how much are you counting on your phone to be safe? What happens? I mean, all that questions, you'll find much more answer around that. My last element, and that is also questions I have to you, seeing the difference of age between you and me, I still feel that there is a generation gap, right? There's a lot of discussions about where is this gap, right? At what age and what does that change? But it's true, we do have generation of people, and I'm part of that, where that has somewhat navigate their childhood and part of their adult life without really being in a digital world, a little bit, but not that much. Whereas you have a generation, you and maybe the people who are listening to us, they have been, navigating, the first years of their life, education, school, and then their life into a digital framework. And I'm intrigued to know, how do you feel this generation gap and divide somewhat will be felt or is felt, at level of city? What does that mean? Do we have to accept that there is really a total generational gap into management and understanding these issues, and also being maybe more fluid about it? I really would be interested to know your view on that one.
That's a great question. Not the core of my research, and I actually managed to grow up a little bit offline. And I think it's interesting to see people who are in their 20s, for example, who've really been online forever. But I think what research shows is that younger people are typically very savvy about how they manage their privacy. So there are practices like they like apps that delete information, like Snapchat or things like that. They have different social media profiles. So they're nuanced at navigating their identity online in ways that maybe non-very tech savvy people, maybe older, are. Like there's always the person on Facebook that instead of sending you a private message, like writes on your wall in caps lock. And so that's something where you notice the difference in digital literacy. But I think there's also something with younger generations about how we navigate the city and the type of spaces that are available in cities. And that is somewhat intermediated by technology, but I don't think it's the root cause. So I think something that we are going to have to deal with is that you had a whole generation that was stuck at home for 2 years when they were 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and they were online instead. So that might change some of their social interactions for real, like at very levels. Did you learn how to flirt? Did you learn how to socialize? And so I think there's something about how we as societies are building spaces for youth that maybe are less or not less open right now, given to surveillance. I think there's also something about how much do we offer room for failure and mistakes to young people. Like if you think about digitization and how your information is stored and how things about you are known for a long time, I think there might, I don't know if how much I will hold on to this in the future, but I think there's something about, are the mistakes you made by when you're 16 relevant for a long time? Like, do we need to create those spaces? One of the things that digitization creates is that many of the things that were sort of in our life by accident before now need to be consciously designed. You need to consciously design for serendipity, for example, because technology allows you to not have serendipity. That's the Excellence Institute is a very hybrid and very cyber organization. And how do we curate serendipity within our team is a thing. And beforehand, we would have been somewhere and there would have been a common room and that would have just happened. And now we need to think about those things. And I think those things that are important for youth are things that societies need to bring front and center, and they need to put it at the center of their planning amongst others, because there is a large trend. It's a large trend in Colombia, but I think there's a large trend in many places where you have youth not feeling very included, not feeling a part of it, feeling left behind, an economy that maybe doesn't work for them. And those are very pressing issues that need to be addressed. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I would say I've learned that in my leadership position when I was leader for several organizations. What seems to me different right now is that we're living in a world. For a long time when you were leaders and you would go to a MBA, you know, a master in business administration, and you would talk to the young generation, and the expectation would be that the younger generation will study case study and try to replicate what worked well and what didn't work well. But the notion, the expectation was replicate. And you would come and the leaders will speak and people will look at you and you will replicate. And it comes from human being from long time. You would replicate what your father and mother would do, if possible, the good way, and then that's the way. And I really feel that we're living in that sense, somewhat a new paradigm where the expectation is that you don't replicate anymore, at least not everything, because there are suddenly a numbers of questions and challenge, and the way these challenge are intermingled require really new answer and maybe also new problem analysis, you know, in a different way. And that is interesting, because if that's the case, and that's what we're trying at the Edgeland Institute, and I think we should try that around the world, then you need to integrate the younger generation in critical position from day one, and not just have one representative and talking to them nicely. I've talked to them, but that they are really part of the decision making together with, in fact, the older generation. And that is interesting. So when you think about inclusivity, I think there is also a question about how do we include the different generation together to look at the problems and try to find solutions and find somewhat a balance. And I would say digitalization will I'm sure, accelerate that very, very, very quickly. And I think, again, at city level, if we're back to city maybe is a space, at least in terms of political science and political dynamic, where this can happen in a much more quicker way, in a much more genuine way, where in fact you have a younger generation coming in, which then back to the smart city, and that's maybe what you heard. It's interesting as a concept, but the concept is interesting only if you think about how smart city are operating with people, with the citizen, what kind of social fabric are they building or not, and what are the responsibility and what's the framework in which smart city are operating. So smart city as let's say somewhat an absolute term, I would say doesn't work for me. And I think it's interesting to bring smart city and the different elements that frame what a smart city is. I don't know what you think about that, Beatrice. And then as we are closing, maybe your last request to the people watching us.
No, I think I agree with most of that. It's very interesting. I think like a key takeaway is hopefully that there always need to be an inquiry about what is it that we are making smarter. Like, is the underlying social fabric or institutional setting or institution that we are automating and datafying worth making smarter and worth making more efficient, or do we need to bring solutions that are at the structural level? Like, there may be some instances, medicine for example, but in many of these societal issues that are more political and require a lot of moral thinking and so on, it is very rare the scenario where tech alone will save us from whatever it is we're saving, or will make us better, or data alone. Even when you're thinking about data, you need to be able to ask the right questions, and asking the right questions is something that is a human skill. It's not a skill of machine. So I think that's like one of the key takeaways. And I do, of course, think that there's an important space for youth to be able to ask what are the relevant questions of the time. But I would qualify that in two ways. I think there is something about being an old wolf that is still very important, and it's more about having a more balanced type of leadership institutions. That is important. I think that matters still. And I think there's also something about giving youth the tools, like oftentimes the problem is, of course, that youth are not being included, but it's just there's also instances in which they're not having access to good education. They're not having access to good institutions, to good universities. If they have access to good universities, they have loans that they have to pay forever. So how do we also structure societies in a fair way for youth leadership to emerge in a way that is sustainable and that is also nuanced and informed? I think that's a big part of it also. But yes, of course. And then
Great, thank you very much, Beatriz, and to all the people that was with us. If you want to continue this conversation, you could do that at edgeland.institute. That's our website, but you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram, and we'll be absolutely delighted to continue the conversation with you. We have a lot to learn still together and to explore. So hope to see you very soon. All the best. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.